Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'd like to share with you how I painted this ink and watercolour or line and wash painting. I've tried to keep the background really simple with nice loose brushstrokes to suggest the scene, whereas the tractor itself has been drawn with waterproof black fine liners first, so it's more defined and easier to get that suggestion of detail. But I have kept the drawing or line work nice and loose and simple. It's based on this photograph from Pixabay, and I'm just trying to create the impression of this scene. And I'm making sure I don't get bogged down with too much detail, just getting in all the sort of sketchy lines that I need to outline the tractor and trailer, and using a thicker waterproof fine liner just to get a few darker tonal values. And this gives me the perfect starting point for this line and wash painting. Pause the video here and take a screenshot if you'd like to refer to it for your own painting. I'm using a piece of Milford cold press watercolour paper, 11 by 15 inches or 28 by 38 centimetres. It's taped to my board, and my board is at an angle of about 20 degrees. I'm going to paint the scene wet in wet to start with, so I'm using my large wash brush, which is a 1.5 inch Princeton Aqua Elite modeler brush, to wet the landscape, cutting around the tractor, leaving the tractor dry. And now using mid-value ultramarine blue, I'm creating a really simple sky with these large sweeping horizontal brush strokes. Once I've got the sky in place, then I leave it there, and I'm not going to mess around with that because it's a nice clean sky. It should dry nice and smooth. I've dipped into really rich dark value sap green. It's really rich and it's a nice dry mixture, not too much water, and you can see how I'm using the corner of my brush and the tips of my brush to create my very loose brush strokes that will suggest these summer trees across the tree line at the back of the painting. Creating some slightly smaller trees, some shorter ones, and then some middle-sized trees on this side, using different parts of the brush to make different marks. And of course, this paint will soften and diffuse into the wet sky wash. This is Perylene green, which straight away gives me a lovely dark tonal value. It does lighten quite a lot as it dries, but it works really well with sap green as two sort of pre-mixed greens that work beautifully for these summer paintings. And then once I've got my tree line in, I'm going to use a 3/4 inch flat brush, clean and dry. I'm going to run that across the bottom of the tree line just to remove any paint that's strayed into the field, because I want my field to be that beautiful golden yellow of the crop. A few adjustments, a few more darks here and there with my modeler brush. And then I'm leaving the yellow field unpainted. I'll paint that in later. I've gone back to my sap green mixture, nice and rich. I've painted a middle ground hedge on either side of the tractor, and I've swept in some bold brush strokes just to suggest the foreground. I'm going to bring in some burnt sienna to the bottom right corner, and just a few dabs of burnt sienna to kind of suggest different types of maybe brambles and hedgerow growth here and there. Just making adjustments to the scene on either side of the tractor, and I'll paint the tractor separately later. I'm just going to dab out just below the left side of the trailer because I believe that in the photograph that the crop is being sprayed, so I'm going to see if I can get an impression of some spray coming out from that big sort of hopper on the trailer a bit later. This is my size 5 palette knife. I'm scraping through the rich paint just to suggest a few tree trunks. I'll put some darker ones in later. I just want to start off with some highlights, drawing with my palette knife, scraping it gently through the damp, rich paint. I've laid my board flat now because I don't need the washes to run anymore. And the sheen has just started to go from the foreground, which means it's beginning to dry. And so I'm going to take a little bit of ordinary fine ground table salt and sprinkle a little of that across into the foreground. Maybe a little bit in the middle ground, not excuse me, not too much, but just enough to allow the salt to make some really pretty patterns and suggestions of growth and flowers and weeds in the foreground. And then going back to the palette knife, making a few marks in the foreground, and hopefully as the salt creates its little patterns, these will work with the grass shapes and stems that I've just put in. I now need to leave it to dry completely. And now that it's dry, I hope you can see the pretty little speckles of texture in the foreground from the salt. First thing I'm going to do is paint in this lovely bright yellow field behind the tractor. This is clean water, and I'm using my number 2 quill brush to paint the paper, and then I'm dropping permanent yellow onto the damp paint. You can see that because I pre-wetted the paper, that this lovely rich dark value permanent yellow is filling that paper and softly diffusing into the paper more quickly, and it gives me my beautiful field straight away. Working around the tractor, and there's still a bit of permanent yellow on my brush, so I'm going to brighten up parts of the middle ground and foreground with that colour. You can see how glazing over my initial colour has really brought some lovely fresh life into the greens in the middle ground. This is my rigger brush. It's a size 2 rigger, and I've dipped into my sap green mix, and I'm just painting around the marks that created with my palette knife in the salt in the foreground, just to continue to work on building up the foreground plants. Once I've done that, then I shall dip into some Payne's Grey and start to paint in some tree trunks with the rigger brush, working around the marks that I made previously. And now I'm beginning to put some shadow underneath the tractor and trailer, using that darker mixture. This time it's a bit of Payne's Grey and some Perylene Green, smudging it if I need to, if the lines look a little bit too neat. And then with my darker mixture, just a few marks for some stronger planting across the foreground over here on the left, and hopefully these will catch the eye and lead the eye across the foreground to the tractor and the bright field behind it. Right, let's paint the tractor. For this I'm going to use Pyrrole Red for these sort of red struts and the red parts of the tractor. I'll use yellow ochre for the canister on the trailer, and for some of the other parts just dabbing it here and there, and I'll mix a grey from the yellow, the red and the ultramarine for my tyres. This is a small calligraphy brush, but any small brush with a good point will do for quickly working across the tractor and trailer, painting it in so that it stands out nicely against the field. As you can see, if you refer to the photograph, there's a link to the Pixabay reference in the description below. You'll see that I've kept this very, very simple and just used the main colours. I've not worried about the detail in the trailer and the tractor, just to make sure we get the impression of it without getting bogged down by that detail. And I think it's turned out quite nicely. Back to the modeler brush and my dark colour, just adding a bit of shadow underneath the tractor just to make sure it's bedded into the ground. And just before I paint in the crop spray, I'm going to remove the tape now and have a look at it and see how it looks. Once we remove the tape, the painting looks a lot more finished with its clean white border. And I can sort of judge if there's anything else that needs to be done to the painting, just any more finishing touches. And I think for a bright, sunny, loose summer painting, I think it's looking okay. I'm quite pleased with it. So I'll zoom in, and I'm taking some white gouache and using my small calligraphy brush, any small brush with a good point, a round will do. And I'm going to paint in over the top of the colours that are already there that I've kept paler for this purpose, with white gouache, and sort of try and get the impression of a sort of cloud of spray coming from the back of the trailer. Sort of letting it peter out a bit as it goes further towards the left. Stepping back, taking a little look, and then going in and adding a bit more wet in wet. It will lighten up a little bit as it dries. I don't want this to be too strong and too powerful an effect, just to give that sort of misty look of something coming from the back of the trailer. And then maybe a little bit of extra dark just behind the right edge of that dust cloud, and that helps to add some more contrast and makes that sort of spray stand out a little bit more. And here's the finished line and wash painting. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching that come together. And if you enjoyed this process and you haven't seen my book, then why not take a look at my book, Landscapes in Watercolour. There are 5 line and wash paintings there, as well as 5 step-by-step pure watercolour paintings, and lots of advice to get you started in watercolour painting, especially if you're a beginner. The links are in the description below if that interests you. So now back to this painting. I'm really pleased with the way this has turned out. The background is really loose. We've used strong colour to sort of define the landscape through brushwork and to suggest the landscape rather than painting in any overt detail. The salt textures are really pretty, and I think the line work helps to define the tractor and the trailer strongly against that loose landscape so that it stands out quite well. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and found it helpful in some way. If you did, then please click on the thumbs up button. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, I'd invite you to do so. It's free to do, and it really does help with our reach. And special thanks to all of our patrons who support us over on Patreon. We couldn't run this free-to-view YouTube channel without you. So I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.